Hello, everybody. Tonight we begin with something a little more toothy, and not in a positive sense. We're exploring the gory, terrifying realm of medieval dentistry, when anesthesia was as simple as a mug of ale and a fervent prayer. Teeth were extracted with iron forceps and everyone had halitosis. Please take a moment to like and subscribe to the video before you settle in, but only if you truly like what I do here. It's always interesting to see who is joining us from around the globe, so please let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. Let's ease into tonight's voyage together by turning down the lights and possibly turning on a fan to provide a gentle background hum. If you've ever dreaded a trip to the dentist, count your blessings, because back in medieval Europe, your dentist was probably also your neighborhood blacksmith, and your checkup came with a side of screaming. As a medieval dentist, your story begins with smell rather than creativity. You are raised in a one-room hovel with a thatched roof, a dirt floor, and a family that considers foul breath to be a natural part of life. Nobody has a toothbrush, and nobody cleans their teeth. What about soap? That's for expensive lords and monks with skin issues. You munch on dried roots and crusty bread crusts as a baby because that's what you have. Chilled rings don't help with teething. Whispered prayers and towels drenched in beer ease it. Everyone believes that sobbing indicates strength. In actuality, your first baby tooth will probably decay before it has a chance to fall out on its own because your gums are inflamed. You've already witnessed an adult spit out a molar over supper and continue to chew by the time you're 5 years old. Your father's smile looks like a decaying cemetery, and your grandma keeps her extracted teeth in a bag for good luck. Nobody is worried. This is typical. And the breath comes next. The breath, oh, every grown-up has the odor of an ancient cheese cave filled with regrets. Your pals smell the same, so they don't notice. You have a sensitive nose, though. Unlucky for you, but the first clue that you might be destined for dentistry. When you are 7 years old, you see the local blacksmith use tongs intended for horseshoes to pull a villager's tooth. The man bleeds, yells, and then thanks him. You pose inquiries. Too many. You are then given the rag and instructed to clean up the blood, and all of a sudden, you are the helper. No oath, no ceremony, and no formal title are present. However, your path is sealed on that day. The kid who doesn't fear tongues is you. Blood doesn't make the boy faint. The one who can bite back sickness and boil pliers, well done. You're now the unofficial apprentice to the village's least glamorous job. Forceps are your toys. There is agony in your lessons. And your playmates are molars placed into bowls with a dull clink. You don't aspire to be a scribe, a poet, or even a knight. You hope that the next time someone screams in your face, you won't recoil. Your journey has begun, not with a white coat, but with a very bad fate and a blood-stained apron. Let's clarify one issue. In the Middle Ages, dental hygiene was a fiction, and somewhere in the 6th century, if it ever was, it died shrieking. As the future tooth yanker of the village, you are raised in a society where individuals brush their teeth using nothing, actually. They may rinse with wine or chew on twigs if they're fancy, and we're talking monastery-level fancy. However, the majority of people, they simply let nature do its thing. And molars are not treated well by nature. No floss or toothpaste is used, and there is no awareness that sugar may be harmful to enamel. Mostly because enamel isn't a word anyone's heard of. Misery is the only regular food consumed by sweet peasants. As you get older and more observant, you start to see a trend, even though nobility do like the occasional honey-glazed catastrophe that has a regal flair and speeds up oral decay. It smells like something died in everyone's mouth and brought buddies with them. Halitosis is not a disease. This is a reality. You acquire the ability to communicate remotely. Breathing through your mouth comes naturally to you. The irony is that it only makes your own odor worse. Young children lose their teeth, not from aging, but from chewing on rocks concealed in bread, accidents, or infections. Most people have 2 or 3 ghost teeth by the time they are 10 years old. Where anything once lived, there are holes. People tolerate this in the same way that they accept fleas on their beds or muck on their shoes. Of course, there are herbal therapies. If you can afford it, you may rinse with vinegar or chew mint. However, taking care of your teeth largely entails hoping that the pain will subside before it spreads to your jaw and kills you. Furthermore, nobody discusses the gums. Gums are basically red, swollen meat that bleed when touched. And evidently that's okay. It would have sounded like witchcraft to try to softly stroke them with a delicate bristles brush. You start chronicling this tragedy with curiosity as a young medieval dentist. You use sticks to prod teeth. You discover the distinction between wiggly but alive and clinging on while dead. And you respond, someone who stops the screaming when someone asks what you want to be when you grow up. Because there are only 2 types of grins in your universe, the immature and the toothless. So how does one become a dentist in the Middle Ages? Easy. You don't. There are no board exams, no dental licenses, and no medical universities. Observing others' suffering teaches you things, and working for the most involved man in town, the barber surgeon, is the greatest way to do it. He's not a medical professional. He has blood on his sleeves and is a multi-tool. He trims beards, lances boils, fixes fractured bones, and amputates gangrenous limbs between breakfast and lunch. He pulls teeth, of course. For what reason? You're his apprentice now. You mop the floor. You restrain yelling patients. You get boiling water to look good, not to clean your gear. You watch a leg being amputated during your first week using a dull saw and a leather strap for anesthetic. You pass out twice. You're carrying a torch by week 2, though. By the 3rd week, you're assisting with head support while your mentor uses blacksmith tongs to extract molars. You're promoted to clean-up duty because you ask too many questions. Blood. Stupid. Teeth. Your mentor is a man of common sense. Pull it if it's loose, he advises. Pull it if it's black. Pull it more quickly if they scream. He teaches you that speed is more important than cleanliness in an extraction, that you'll get paid more if you pretend to pray first, and that God, not you, decides whether or not you get infected. There is only instinct, superstition, and repetition. No textbook. You learn to tell which tooth will twist out and which will break in 2, leaving you with a pair of broken pliers and a weeping peasant. You learn your contingency plan when things go awry. Demons are to blame, diet is to blame, or blame the stars in an emergency. In medical thought, astrology is surprisingly common, particularly when the abscess cannot be evacuated and the patient begins to foam at the lips. Sometimes you assist with injuries sustained in the battlefield. You help with leeches sometimes. On tooth days, however, your mentor always makes sure you're present. Because, as he puts it, nothing humbles a guy like bleeding from the face, and you learn, gradually, through terror, through trial, through screams, through blood, you're not a healer. Not quite yet. But in the medieval world, you're evolving into something much more vital. A man who, at a fee, can take away the pain. You're thinking far too contemporary if you're anticipating a tray of shining tools lined with surgical accuracy. The equipment used by a medieval dentist appears to have been taken from a prison. How about you? You're getting better at using each and every component. The pliers come first, dense, rusted, heavy. Not built for dentists, but for horseshoes, meat hooks, and tough nails. The handle smells of old perspiration and iron, the grasp, dubious. However, it is seen effective if it clamps down on something and pulls. The tooth key follows, a twisted tiny crank meant to twist a tooth sideways until it pops loose. It rarely works the first time. It usually splits the tooth in two, and then you have to dig out the root feverishly while the patient sobs into a burlap sleeve. You also have scrapers and hooks. One resembles a shepherd's crook and is ideal for catching obstinate pieces. Another resembles a sharpened spoon used to scoop out abscesses and pack them with mouldy bread or ashes. Is it sterile? Not at all. The mallet is also present. Yes, a mallet. You keep the tool against the tooth and tap it firmly in case the pliers break and you need some convincing. The tooth pops if your aim is accurate. Otherwise, the jaw may move somewhat. There are no labels on the instruments. Some used to be used for caring for animals. Others may have once been fishing implements. The majority of them are passed down from the barber surgeon's deceased mentor, including the tools he received from his mentor. One has a handle with a notch etched into it. It's either someone's death toll or a maker's mark. Cleaning is not required. They are occasionally passed through a flame and occasionally cleaned with a cloth, not to sterilize but to create drama. You can think of bloodstains as seasoning. Maintaining the tool's organization, cleanliness, and readiness at all times is your responsibility. The last thing someone wants is to be delayed when they enter with their jaw clenched. They want you to pull something fast. Additionally, don't ask too many questions. These are not medical devices, they are benevolent weapons, and it's up to you to determine whether a man leaves with a smile or never leaves again. There was no dental science in the Middle Ages. However, theories, they had plenty, I see. There was no decay or bacteria causing tooth pain. Enamel might as well have been a form of prayer because no one understood what plaque was. What then did people think was the origin of those jaw-splitting, throbbing, pus-filled toothaches? Worms. Tiny, vicious, unseen worms. Tooth worms, indeed. Like termites in a timber beam, these legendary little creatures were thought to dig into your molars and nibble away day and night. A toothache indicated that the worm was hungry. The worm has completed its meal if it broke in two. When someone asks, "Is it the worm again, master?" you're instructed to look serious and nod intelligently as a future dentist. And since it always is, you answer yes. There is, of course, the religious component as well. Some claim tooth discomfort is punishment from God for lying, for vanity, or for eating too much honeyed bread. Your occupation? To remove the sinful teeth as if you're exorcising a demon with pliers. Before an extraction, patients frequently ask you to say a prayer. You comply, perhaps a bit out of fear, as much as mostly to soothe them. You've seen diseases go to the neck and kill men in a matter of days, after all. The gods must be engaged, right? However, the most widely held belief, and the one your mentor firmly believes in, is that the worm will emerge if you place a roasted onion next to the tooth that hurts. You never see anything but tears and steam, of course. No worms. However, the patient thinks so. Onion breath and placebo magic. A double cure from the Middle Ages. You even learn a few worm-charming practices. One is to threaten the worm by speaking to the teeth. Another method is to smoke out the worm by boiling a concoction of wax, herbs, and goat fat, and then dripping it close to the gums. Warning, it never succeeds. You eventually come to terms with the reality. It's about belief, not worms. Even if it's a ridiculous one, people desire an explanation for their suffering. It's simpler to imagine a ravenous worm than to face the truth of decay, illness, and death. Thus you continue. Heal. Priest. Pest control. In the realm of medieval mouth monsters, it's just another day. As the villagers screamed, you saw your mentor pull out dozens of teeth. You've passed the tools, held down the heads, and then cleaned up the mess. However, nothing at all, gets you ready for the moment you're given the pliers. Edric, a middle-aged farmer, is the patient. For a week, his teeth has been hurting. He hasn't eaten, prayed, or slept, according to his wife. He's so desperate now that he'll let a teenager pull it out. Your tutor takes a step back and nods, and you try not to shudder. "Go on," he says, his apron filthy, and his arms crossed. "It's time to earn your fingers." Edric is sitting on a seat with wild eyes and white knuckles. Something you mutter could be a prayer. He answers with what could be his final words. You discover a dark, broken molar tooth with swollen, seemingly impending gums. Sweat-slick hands, you position the forceps. Edric stiffens. You whisper, "On 3. 1, you twist on 2 as well. That's what you learned. Don't hold off until 3. Mercy, in a way. The tooth remains stationary. Because he kind of is, Edric screams as if he's being skinned alive. You tighten your hold and apply more pressure. For a brief time you believe you've done it when you hear a horrible snap, but the tooth remains buried like a sharp little dagger, with half of it coming out. Your mentor lets out a sigh. Continue. The following few minutes are a haze of terror, blood, metal twisting and curses. When you finally manage to pull out the final piece, the force almost knocks you back. Edric falls forward with a pale face and a red mouth. You've succeeded. You have trembling hands. You appear to have killed a pig with your apron. Edric is still alive, though. Sobbing, yes, but in the bewildered, pain-shocked way that only a peasant from the Middle Ages can be, appreciative. You cover his head, fill it with herbs, and rinse the wound with wine. He smiles bloodily as he thanks you. You try not to throw up or cry, perhaps both. Your mentor slaps your back later. "Not bad," he says. You just slightly crack your jaw. That night, you sleep with the tooth in your pocket. It was your first trophy, your initial scar. After a few tooth extractions, you begin to notice something that persists. Not in the office. Not on your clothing. Not even in your dreams. It's the odor, the slight sourness in the air, initially sneaks up on you. You think it might be your mentor's feet or the stew that's simmering next door. However, it becomes apparent that it is originating from mouths. The smell of decaying teeth is distinct. A sickening mixture of blood, pus, spoiled food, and the distinct taste of decaying flesh. It hits you like a wall every time a patient opens wide. It remains with you as well. It seeps into your fingernails, hair, and apron, and you begin to notice other things as well. The scent of terror. It's true, metallic and sharp, particularly when your patient is knuckling white on the chair arms, eyes darting, and perspiring through their tunic. Fear has a very specific way of making people smell. It blends with the damp wool, the garlic breath, the tooth decay, and the subtle scent of despair. It cannot be penetrated by a lamp or bundle of herbs. You give up trying. Additionally, you begin recording the number of persons who faint before the pliers even come in contact with their mouth. Catching heads before they fall is a skill you acquire. You get skilled at anticipating who will try to flee, who will faint, and who will scream. For that, you now have a rope, commonplace. Sometimes the decay is so severe that the tooth crumbles like moldy bread beneath your tool. It's not a tooth that emerges, it's one person's memory, soft and blackened. An infection in the future and a piece of a previous meal. It doesn't help that you try not to breathe too deeply. The scent has become a part of you. When you exit the workshop, people automatically back off. When you pass, kids cry. You've turned into an olfactory sign. A merchant you assisted weeks ago happens to walk by you in the market one day. After giving a courteous nod, he covers his nose with a handkerchief. You're accustomed to it, because you need more than just tools and bandages in this world. The smell of all the open mouths you have ever reached into is with you, and there will be plenty more in the future. You no longer consider mouths to be a part of persons by this point. After the conflict, you are sent in, and you view them as battlegrounds. Every patient in your chair has a tale to tell, and it's always written in broken enamel, blood, and rot. They have terrible mouths, caves with exposed nerves, shattered molars, blackened stumps, and gums that resemble overripe fruit. Some teeth cling to their neighbors like inebriated soldiers, leaning sideways. Others stand lonely and ragged, soft to the touch and yellow with age. Additionally, the gums underneath them are enlarged, decayed, and either red or grey. And you've seen maggots more than once. You no longer ask inquiries, simply pry it open to inspect the damage. When the patient breathes, some of the teeth move, others that as soon as your tool touches them burst into pieces. You've seen mouths with roots sticking out of pus-filled pits, and not a single tooth left in place. Infections are another issue. Heavens, please. Under the tongue, it boils. Behind the molars are cysts, whole jaws that move in time with the heartbeat. At one point, you emptied a walnut-sized pocket of pus. Through tears, the man thanked you. It was a successful day. You work quickly, not for efficiency, but because it becomes worse the longer you look. These aren't visits to the dentist. These are sessions of triage. You do not repair. You scrape, remove, and pray. For discarded teeth, you have a pail. By noon, it fills up. The weight doesn't hit until the stench does. You start to identify people just by their speech. It appears to be recognizable. You are more than simply a mouth healer now. In your own chair, you're a ticking jaw. You are no longer recoiling at cries. You hardly even notice them. They serve as the background music for your line of work, resonating like a choir of sorrow and regret off of wooden beams and stone walls. Every shriek is different. Some are low and guttural like an injured animal, while others are high-pitched and frightened. You used to be consoling. A prayer in a whisper, a warm cloth, and a falsehood that this won't hurt much. After your fifth extraction, when the man bit through your glove and sobbed through it all, that stopped. There's no sugar-coating it anymore. In any case, you have no sugar, only leather straps, pliers, and the emotional detachment that only a medieval dentist can cultivate. Most days, you don't even have numbing herbs or anesthesia. To soften the edge, you have a bottle of wine. If they're lucky, they'll also have someone to keep them in check, ideally a husband or a strong neighbor who doesn't mind getting blood on their hands. It's an easy process. Depending on how obstinate the tooth is, you wedge open the mouth, find it, and then twist, pull, or hammer it. The patient screams, thrashes, and calls out to long-dead saints, but you continue because if you stop, things will only get worse. Before you even touch them, some scream. Others become rigid and quiet, the sort of silence that indicates they are too afraid to breathe. People have fainted, puked, and soiled themselves in the middle of procedures, yet you have persevered through it all. They may yell your name at times, not with thanks, but with curses. You've been referred to as a devil in boots, a butcher, and a demon. According to one man, you were sent from hell to use iron pincers to punish gluttons. Most patients don't thank you after you take it as a praise. They stutter away, shouting oaths and oozing blood as they grasp their face. Some people nod. Lower wages. The closest thing to a 5-star review are those who make it through with their jaw intact. However, you are never forgotten, because you are the one who exchanges agony for a little less anguish in a world without comfort. And for that, people will always yell. Eventually, it was inevitable. You've dealt with dozens, perhaps hundreds, of yelling, thrashing patients. You have escaped elbows, knees, and even one unintentional headbutt from a terrified nun. Nothing, however, can get you ready for the bite. It begins much like any other process. Sweating and growling through a swollen face, a local miller enters with his jaw hanging down, as if it were about to fall off. He growls, "Just get it out," the quintessential tough dude. After positioning him and saying your customary half-prayer, you begin examining the molar. A complete mess, cracked, black, barely surviving. The pliers aren't even necessary yet. To check for movement, simply poke around with your finger. It occurs at that point. He tightens his grip. 2 decaying teeth have snagged your finger. All of a sudden, you know what true pain feels like. He shouts and you scream. Another person in the waiting area lets out a sympathetic scream. You attempt to distance yourself, but it's too late. He locks his jaw in desperation. You're not being attacked by him. He's in a panic. However, intentions are irrelevant to your skin. It's shattering. Your glove is filled with blood. Your mentor rushes in and uses the blunt end of the tooth key to try to pry open his mouth. Eventually, it works. You grasp your hand like it's made of fire as you stumble back. You have a torn, half-gone nail on one of your fingertips. Your hand instantly swells. Naturally, there is no antiseptic, just boiled water, alcohol, and the prayer that God isn't feeling vindictive right now. You tighten your grip and continue. You need the coins for the remaining 5 scheduled extractions. Your hand is aching and crimson by midnight. Infection spreads quickly because, surprisingly, there are many horrors in human tongues. You get a fever. You dream about talking to the Virgin Mary about molars for 2 days. You get better eventually, for the most part. Never again does your finger bend perfectly. Just a friendly reminder. The miller? Once a year, he brings you toothless, guilt-ridden bread. You work in a different way after that, quicker and more careful, and you begin testing a loose tooth with a metal probe rather than your finger, because dogs aren't the most deadly bite in your line of work. Given their feathered caps and silk robes, you would expect the nobles would have superior teeth. No, they don't. In actuality, their mouths seem to get worse the wealthier they are. Why? The impoverished never taste luxury because they can afford it. Imported wines, sugar, candied fruits, and pastries so sweet that they almost melt your teeth's enamel when they come into contact with them. You are taken to castles and manor homes where the floors are shiny but the faces are hideous. There are mouths in full rebellion, abscesses the size of walnuts, gums like bruised fruit, and teeth so blackened you wonder if they've been cursed, hiding behind powdered faces and perfumed robes. Nevertheless, the nobles demand caution, grace, and elegance. You kneel next to them, looking into the jaws of what appears to be a battlefield covered in rot and honey as they sit on velvet couches. They prefer that you work fast, silently, and, if at all possible, without revealing to them what you're taking out. According to one noblewoman, her tooth is just not resting correctly. 3 bleeding fragments are removed. They don't let out a peasant yell. No, they let out a theatrical moan. With a flourish, they pass out. They gripe that the linen is too scratchy or the herbal rinse is too bitter. One lord insisted that you halt the extraction so he could write a poem. Additionally, if a noble loses a front tooth, it needs to be replaced or covered. This brings us to the topic of cosmetic dentistry. You've used wax to fill in gaps, white lead, yes, it's toxic, to paint teeth, and once sculpted an ivory imitation canine that fell out during a feast. At least they pay well. Rings, coins, chickens, and once a cloak, albeit one that smelled like wet dog. However, they also demand favors, the keeping of secrets and stroking of egos. You're not bothered, because it always reminds you of something significant when a baron or duchess opens their mouth anticipating beauty, and you look inside to see the same rotting pit as any street beggar. Decay is democratic. How wealthy you are is irrelevant. How about you? With pliers in hand, you're the great equalizer, prepared to tell everyone that they all rot the same behind the silk and titles. Your reputation now comes before you, but not in the way you had hoped. Conversations end the moment you enter a tavern. Kids hide behind their moms. Once, a man crossed himself and spat at your feet while saying something about plague demons. To protect him from your curse, another created a charm to put around his neck. You're not a hero. You're not a healer at all. The tooth man is you. And that's a bad sign. Like starvation or taxes, you are viewed by the peasants as a necessary evil. Only when the agony surpasses their fear do they turn to you. Medieval dentists are not lightly visited. They wait until they are half dead from infection, crazy and desperate. Then they show up at your door, hat in hand, trembling. At first, you attempt to be gentle, but it doesn't matter. They become terrified as soon as they notice the pliers. Some people wince when you talk. People don't look at you. With what teeth they still have, the bravest smile nervously. Nobody appreciates what you've done. They shout when you do it correctly. They scream more when it's done badly. When a life is saved, it is forgotten. Pulling poorly is legendary. According to one woman, you extracted the incorrect tooth. You didn't. Nevertheless, the tale gets out there until you're the guy who enjoys stealing teeth. Once, a bunch of boys sang a short song while following you around town. 2 for the priest, 1 for the farmer. He will prepare a feast if you don't hide your teeth. You have no choice but to chuckle. However, it hurts. You have no desire to be feared. You wanted to assist. Fear does have its uses, though. People pay more quickly. They pay attention. When people believe you might pull the wrong tooth to make a point, they don't challenge your pricing. And you are the first person they call when someone passes out in the street due to an obsession. You are their only option, not because they trust you. So you get into the ring again, open your equipment and roll up your sleeves. No one loves you. People don't like you, but people do remember you. Pure survival takes precedence over dentistry when the pandemic strikes. Cavities are of no concern to the Black Death. It leaves you wondering if that preoccupied jaw is the start of the end or simply an abscess as it fills the streets with fevered people. People still come to you, though. They always do. You've dealt with pus before, not because you're a miracle worker. You have witnessed wounds packed with herbs, drained rot, and swelling. You've seen jaw infections cause folks to scream themselves hoarse. What is the point of another plague boil amongst friends? You start doing emergency lancing instead of extractions. Neck edema. Gums that are black. Chicken egg-sized lymph nodes. You grab the skin, heat your blade, and cut. Like a fruit with blisters, pus explodes. You no longer gag. It's been years since you did. They can occasionally survive. They don't always. You begin recording your progress in chalk on your door. To prevent your thoughts from collapsing, not out of conceit. Now payment is strange. There are no coins. They therefore make payments in the form of bread, dried meat, or promises they will never be able to keep. You get a ring from a dying merchant. You get the boots from a widow's late spouse. You bury what you have to and sell what you can. The odors get stronger. Your studio becomes into a kind of crypt and clinic. It doesn't assist to store firewood for warmth. It's colder now, within the bones. When 3 consecutive patients never sit up again, there is a pause. You're busy, though. The epidemic is wonderful for business, but bad for the body. And you are mentioned in whispers. My neighbor was the one who drained the poison from his neck. The man who extracted the 3 diseased teeth lived, the one who may have knowledge that the priests do not. They are not corrected by you, because being a little less lethal makes you powerful in a time when everyone is dying. Thus, you continue to cut, drain, pack, and pray over wounds. You don't get much sleep. You don't talk unless absolutely necessary. However, you are still alive. And at work, You're more than just the man with pliers in the epidemic era. When it's nearly too late, they call you. The pain is dull at first. Nothing major. A sore back tooth following a demanding day. Easily disregarded. However, you are more knowledgeable. It's a narrative you've heard 100 times before. It always begins as nothing. After that, it becomes everything. You initially act as though it's exhaustion. You spit out wine. You chew cloves. When no one else is around, you massage your jaw. However, you are aware that the rot has arrived within you. You attempt to resolve it. There are lips worse than yours, after all. Peasants with absolutely no teeth, nobles who wilt, flowers with their breath. You've made it through other people's cries. You can certainly survive your own. However, the discomfort intensifies. Your jaw crawls up, right into your ear, behind your eye. You give up eating. You cut off your speech. The tooth begins to appear in your dreams, the identical one, again and again, slipping out, worm growth. I'm whispering in Latin to you. You think about seeking assistance from your apprentice. He's too green, though. He pauses. He continues to use his sleeve to wipe his instruments. So one night you perform what you've been doing for years in the quiet light of your own workshop. Your own tooth gets pulled. A wooden block is wedged between your molars. Keep your hand steady and bring the pliers in. This is something you've done hundreds of times. Gripping, twisting, and removing are all skills you possess. You haven't done it to yourself, though. There is no way to describe the pain, since it's yours, not because it's worse. You moan, half angry, half in pain. Sweat permeates your tunic. Blood is what you taste. Then there was more blood. And then, at last, relief, in a way. The tooth falls into your bowl of tin. Alongside the others, it rattles. You look at it for a moment. In a room full of destroyed things, this one is just another. You tend to the wound. You fail to pack it. Out of pride, not carelessness. Either you'll recover or you won't. That has always been the case. The ache subsides. However, something remains. For the first time, you realize the true meaning behind every scream. You now hold it in your empty jaw as well as in your hands. For a medieval dentist, there is no happy ending, no funeral in a cathedral, no golden plaque, no choir praising the removal of abscesses and the yanking of molars. Just an elderly man with crooked metal tools, hunched over his bench, wearing an apron covered with blood. Now your hands hurt. Like gritted teeth, your knees grind. In the evenings, your eyesight becomes blurry, and the sounds of 1,000 previous screams echo in your ears. You move more slowly, yet the patients still come in. You talk less. Your fingers no longer shut painlessly while you hold the pliers. You feel bread as you grab for it one day. A fissure. In your mouth, a gentle crumble. Another lost tooth. Your own. Once more, it's not worth saving. You can no longer count. You don't eat apples anymore. Now you drink your food. Chew only as needed. Like a soldier on a deserted battlefield, your tongue runs across the spaces in your mouth. Every year, the number of survivors declines. There are moments when you question whether the people will remember you when you're gone. The man with kindness in his hands and death on his breath. This person had more teeth than most people thought. To be honest, though, they won't construct a tomb for you. As a priest, you are not a knight, are you? They screamed a little less because of you, the man. It will be a shallow grave for you. A wooden plank was scratched with your name. Perhaps. Perhaps not. But what did you do? It endures. In every mouth that continues to chew painlessly. In each youngster who survived a jaw infection. In every aristocrat who never expressed gratitude and concealed their decay beneath a fake grin, and under your workbench, in the pail of teeth. A silent tribute to a life filled with nerve, rust, and blood. There won't be a procession of mourners when you pass away. only a stench that lingers for too long and a hush in the workshop. The pliers will eventually be picked up by someone else, someone less tormented, younger and more hungry. They'll scream again. For now, however, your hands remain motionless. You start to lose your breath. Additionally, a child will experience a painful toothache somewhere in the village. Where's the man who stops it, they'll ask. You'll be gone, though. Only gums, no tombstone. Skin existed before silk, before linen, before anything that even vaguely resembled a fashion statement. Skin exposed to the sun, wind, cold, insects, and all other elements of nature. Clothing wasn't about style in the early days of human history. It was a matter of survival. In order to survive the night, the earliest humans had to quickly adapt to their harsh and merciless surroundings. The answer? Anything that was laying around, including flexible tree bark, weaved reeds, animal hides from hunting, and even grass that had been twisted into crude skirts and belts. It wasn't attractive, but it was effective. And this is where clothing originated, in this primordial instant. They weren't clothes, they served as shields. Although a predator's fur may keep you warm during the winter, it also made you smell like food to the next lion that sniffed. However, warmth was more important to early people than beauty. We wrapped raw skins around ourselves, bound them together with vines or sinew, and prayed. However, even these rudimentary covers began to acquire symbolic significance throughout time. Who's that guy with the largest bear hide? Most likely the person who killed it. The one wearing the grass skirt with the elaborate weaving. She might have been the healer, the storyteller, or the elder. Clothes started to signify more than just safety. Status was whispered. Bone needles, the oldest archaeological evidence of clothing tools, date back around 40,000 years, indicating that we were already making more fitted clothing out of animal hides. It is more than just functional. That's considerate. It's human. Additionally, our attire changed in accordance with our migration to other regions, such as humid rainforests, scorching deserts, and freezing tundras. Our bodies were sheltered in chilly climates by tight wrappings and layered furs. We switched to breathable, loosely draped materials in hotter climates. This was more than a simple invention. Adaptation was the term. Therefore, although the idea of early people roaming freely and untamed is alluring, the truth is much more realistic. Clothes were our first technological tool as soon as we started covering ourselves. Sewn together with necessity and a sliver of early pride, it was a subtle revolution in fiber and fur. And this was just the start. Ancient Egypt conjures images of pyramids, jackal-headed gods, and golden masks. But if you look more closely, you'll see something else. Everyone is wearing immaculate linen clothing. Not wool, not silk. Linen. Not just any linen either. Clean, whitened, and perfectly pleated. The perfect fabric for Egypt's hot, dry atmosphere was linen. It could be worn in layers without retaining too much heat because it was lightweight and breathable. The production of linen, which was made from the flax plant, required a lot of work. Harvesting, soaking, and beating the flax into submission were the first steps. After that, it was spun into tiny threads and then sewn into cloth. This was no informal attire. Because it required a lot of work, linen was valued. Priests, pharaohs, and even the deceased wore it when they were mummified in layers upon layers of meticulously prepared linen wrappings. Egyptians held that attire had significance in both life and death. In the afterlife, your clothing helped protect your identity. A well-dressed mother was more than just a style statement. It was strengthened spiritually. What you wore was actually a reflection of your social standing. Semi-transparent linen tunics, frequently pleated or dyed white, a color linked to purity and heavenly power, were worn by the aristocracy. Ordinary workers also enjoyed the cool elegance of linen, but they wore simpler kilts, often nothing more than a wrapped cloth tied with a belt. Even the first piece of clothing was a rite of passage. even though children frequently wore nothing until adolescence. Naturally, jewelry completed the look. Gold and faience wide collars, sandals with beads, and lapis lazuli amulets. At formal dinners, a nobleman's attire may include kohl-lined eyes, wigs, and fragrant cones that melt over the head. Egypt's fashion wasn't frivolous, it was identity, position, and ritual. Priests wore only the best white linen and nothing made from animals, since they had to maintain ritual cleanliness. Not wool, no leather. Clothes were more than just fabric. It served as spiritual armor, keeping the sacred and the profane apart. Even servants and slaves wore clothes appropriate to their jobs, albeit they were rarely decorated. However, linen dominated Egyptian fashion for thousands of years, regardless of whether they tended the palace or worked the fields. Therefore, Egypt was leading one of the first fabric revolutions in human history, while other civilizations continued to bundle themselves in skins and wool, sunlit, silky, and sewn into infinity. If Egypt used flax to spin gold, Mesopotamia used wool to weave its civilization. The first city-states were also the first to set patterns in the rich regions between the Tigris and Euphrates. Their style? Woolen layers, broad belts, draped robes, the pride of Babylon, Assyria, Akkad, and Sumer. Here, wool was used for more than just clothes. It was economic. There were sheep everywhere, and Mesopotamian trade, temple contributions, and taxation all depended on their wool. Indeed, temple complexes functioned as small empires, controlling flocks and textile production. Clothes was centrally located, simultaneously bureaucratic and spiritual. The kaunakes, a wraparound skirt or tunic that is frequently woven from tufted wool, which gives it a shaggy, pelt-like look, with a standard male attire. It initially appeared as though someone had untrimmed and skinned a sheep. That's pretty close to the truth. However, it evolved into a ceremonial, stylized garment, even a regal one, over time. Its prestige was demonstrated by the frequent depictions of kings, priests, and gods wearing kaunakes robes. Women's clothing was draped similarly, however occasionally it revealed one shoulder and reached the ankles. Sensible but elegant. Unlike Egyptian linen, these garments were not fitted or stitched. Rather than being molded by stitchwork, they were shaped by artistry through wrapping and pinning. Details were determined by social class. Elites donned deep reds, rich indigos, and finely dyed wool, perhaps embellished with embroidery or fringe. Coarser versions were worn by laborers and servants. Additionally, children frequently remained nude until a certain age, much like in Egypt. After all, in the early civilizations, modesty was a malleable term. To secure their clothing, Mesopotamians also used broad belts or girdles, frequently composed of leather or wool cords. Occasionally embellished with bronze studs or with names, prayers, or symbols of heavenly protection, these belts were status objects. Headgear was widespread, particularly among men. Turbans, headbands, and conical caps served as status and identity markers. Priests and royalty wore more ornate coverings, while soldiers and messengers would wear plain leather caps. The look was finished with jewelry. Necklaces, bracelets, and earrings crafted from carnelian, lapis, silver, and gold. For protection, even the poorest people frequently wore at least a basic amulet or bead. Thus, Mesopotamia strutted in wool, rough, heated, and heavy with significance, whereas Egypt flowed in linen. They used more than just fabric to get their draped look. It was about piety, power, and the first wardrobes ever made. The people of the Indus Valley subtly transformed clothing with cotton, which was soft, breathable, and remarkably ahead of its time, while Egypt perfected linen and Mesopotamia showed off wool. Yes, real cotton that has been spun and weaved, and it was more than 5,000 years ago. The Indus Valley civilization, which was centered on towns like Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa, did not leave behind any magnificent temples or regal tombs. However, it did leave behind signs of a very well-organized, clean, and stylish civilization. Their simple, practical, and clean attire was ideal for the hot, muggy weather of what is now northwest India and Pakistan. We have proof in the form of stamp impressions, terracotta figurines, and even quite intricate sculptures. Women draped longer clothing, sometimes over one shoulder, while men usually wore a short kilt or wrapped cloth fastened around the waist. Consider it the sari's primitive ancestor. Both sexes wore simple yet tasteful attire that was always appropriate for the heat and action. Indeed, they were the first known culture to grow cotton. This was revolutionary, not merely resourceful. Compared to the heavier animal-based fibers of other countries, cotton's suppleness and breathability made it perfect for everyday use. It was probably spun, woven, and dyed using natural pigments by the Indus people. Maybe turmeric or indigo, both of which were found in the area. Being simple does not equate to being boring. Numerous figures depict women wearing ornate jewelry, such as beaded necklaces, earrings, and bangles up their arms. Hair was frequently braided or groomed, and cosmetic containers and ornamental combs discovered during excavations suggest regular grooming practices. The Dancing Girl is a well-known bronze sculpture that dates to approximately 2500 BCE. She only has a few bangles on, but her posture, self-assurance, and jewelry speak volumes about her cultural comfort in a graceful and understated way. It's remarkable how little excess and waste appear to have characterized Indus dress. Grandiosity was not a problem. Instead, there was a focus on well-made, locally sourced, climate-appropriate apparel that blended in with everyday living. No heavy layers or gold-studded robes, only the sophistication of simple lines and ingenious fabric. Fashion was years ahead of its time, but it wasn't noisy in Harappa's sleepy streets. Fashion had drastically changed from simple utilitarian to something far more expressive and, to be honest, spectacular by the time the Minoans gained popularity on the island of Crete around 2000 BCE. In order to live in the Mediterranean environment, the Minoans did more than simply dress. They dazzled, moved, seduced, and, perhaps most importantly, danced with their clothes. Light and vibrant, Minoan attire was designed for both visual drama and heat. Men usually wore kilts or loincloths, sometimes bare-chested with tight belts to draw attention to the waist, and other times ornate with patterned sashes. However, the women's attire was the real star of the event. Women are seen wearing clothing that is unlike anything seen in other ancient societies in Minoan frescoes, such those at Knossos. Fitted bodices with flounced, layered skirts that were remarkably open in the front, exposing the breasts, and occasionally bell-shaped or tiered. Not by chance, no. This was fashion, perhaps ritual, perhaps prestige, and definitely deliberate. Women's hourglass silhouettes were created by these corset-like shirts, which tightened the waist while permitting flexibility. Particularly during the athletic dances and religious festivals for which the Minoans were renowned, the skirts swayed significantly with each step. Here, clothes weren't static. It had kinetic energy. Each fold, layer, and color experimented with motion. Plant-based pigments were used to color the garments, which were probably made of linen or wool, in vivid shades of blue, red, yellow, and purple. Visual interest was enhanced with needlework, decorative borders, and possibly even imported threads. Flair was obviously understood by Minoan tailors. They were doing more than just cutting fabric. Identity was being shaped by them. Jewelry, necklaces, bracelets, and intricate earrings, frequently crafted from gold, silver, and semi-precious stones like carnelian and turquoise, were worn by both men and women. Intricate headdresses or caps were used during ceremonial events, and hair was long and groomed, perhaps curled or braided. Even young children were clothed with care, suggesting that attire affected not only function, but also how one performed their age, rank, and social role. Furthermore, women's prominence in Minoan art suggests that their ornate attire may have represented more than just beauty. It might have communicated power. The Minoans transformed fashion from the loom to the stage, turning each ensemble into a moving sculpture and each hem into a theatrical production. Clothes in ancient China were never made of fabric alone. It was a tool of imperial authority, philosophy, and hierarchy. Silk is at the center of it all. Beautiful, glistening silk so highly valued that it was formerly thought to be spun by the gods. Although the lowly silkworm was the source of it, the repercussions of its discovery would span centuries and nations. The earliest known evidence of silk's origins dates to approximately 2700 BCE during the Neolithic era. Legend has it that Empress Lezu was the first to find the tiny filament inside a cocoon that had fallen into her tea. Whether it is true or not, the manufacture of silk swiftly rose to the top of China's list of secrets. Giving away the recipe? Executed as punishment. Silk was already recognized as the pinnacle of Chinese expertise by the Shang and Zhou eras. Silk flowing, light, cold, and radiant, in contrast to rigid linen or gritty wool. It retained dye nicely and was perfect for China's diverse conditions. Bold blues, rich reds, and imperial yellows were woven into elaborate designs. Waves for courtiers, clouds for intellectuals, and dragons for rulers. Class-based clothing became standardized. Your rank increased with the amount of silk you wore. Everything from your social standing to your employment might be conveyed by the cut, color, and even length of the sleeves. Members of the nobility floated around palaces in robes that almost spoke power with every stride, while commoners were prohibited from wearing specific colors or weaves. Silk was developed into a diplomatic weapon during the Han era, 206 BCE to 220 CE. The Silk Road got its name from the silk bolts that were exchanged with nomads, offered as tribute, and eventually transported westward. Wide-sleeved robes, sashes, and several layers were increasingly common in Chinese attire, particularly among the affluent. Cultural identity became a matter of how a robe folded, left over right. Decorative hairpins, long flowing sleeves, and high-waisted skirts were all part of women's fashion. Men's clothing emphasized humility and grace, which was consistent with Confucian principles. It was believed that clothing should represent cosmic equilibrium and inner virtue. Silk was more than simply a luxury. It was a subtle yet powerful language. In ancient China, one's attire reflected not just one's appearance, but also one's identity, beliefs, and place in society. Ancient Greek dress flowed, rapped, and whispered elegance rather than screaming for attention. The Greeks didn't care about stitching or tailoring. They took an architectural, almost sculptural approach to clothes. They made clothing that conveyed movement, intelligence, and grace with just one piece of fabric, just geometry, draperies, and a profound regard for form, no scissors or seams. The chiton, a rectangular sheet of linen or wool that was folded, pinned at the shoulders with brooches or fibulae, and belted at the waist, was the basic Greek garment. The chiton might be formal and layered or airy and light, depending on the drape and material. It was knee-length for men and ankle-length for women. Adaptable to age, gender, and occasion, it served as a canvas of identity. Depending on how it was worn, citizens could cover this with a himation, a heavier cloak slung over one shoulder that could be used for drama, modesty, or warmth. Consider it a wearable toga, a representation of respect and reflection that is frequently connected to elders, statesmen, and philosophers. The Greeks held that one's attire should reflect one's moral character. They praised simplicity, particularly at Athens, where public humility was regarded as a civic virtue. Extravagance was discouraged. Even more austere, Spartan males prioritized austerity over attractiveness and frequently wore coarse red wool while going barefoot. Don't be fooled by the simplicity, though. Greek clothing could be really beautiful. Richer people wore chitons that were dyed and embroidered with mythical and meandering patterns in crimson, indigo, or saffron. Cosmetics, hairstyles, and jewelry all improved the entire appearance. Women adorned their hair with elaborate braids, tiaras, or ribbons. Men were as proud of their beards as they were of their speeches. Shoes were not required. Although sandals were popular, many Greeks favored going barefoot, particularly at symposia or temples. Clothes were used for more than merely covering. It was a dialogue with the world. Nobility could be conveyed with a well-draped hymation. A messy chiton could be an indication of insanity or grief. The folds of these clothing were preserved in marble by Greek statues, which were frequently modeled after real people. To remind mortals that beauty was found in form rather than flesh, even gods wore chitons and cloaks. Greek fashion ultimately focused on how you wore your clothing rather than what you wore. Thoughtfully, elegantly, and, most importantly, with philosophy interwoven throughout. The Romans fashioned their identities into order, while the Greeks clothed them in flowing elegance. Roman apparel was more than just a matter of style or comfort. It was a patchwork of law, status, and Romanitas. In ancient Rome, one's attire conveyed to the world one's identity, level of authority, and even Senate seat. The toga, a huge semicircular woolen gown that might be up to 20 feet long and was painstakingly wrapped around the torso, was the most recognizable item of Roman clothing. It was heavy, unusable, and difficult to wear correctly without experience. However, that was the main objective. The toga was restricted to male Roman citizens. It represented Roman citizenship and thus Roman superiority. Depending on your status, togas came in a variety of colors and styles. Adult male citizens wore plain white toga virilis. For magistrates and some priests, the purple-bordered toga praetexta was appropriate. Additionally, only emperors and victorious generals were allowed to wear the toga picta, which was completely purple with gold embroidery. Originating from the murex marine snail, purple dye was so costly that it was practically worth its weight in gold. Togas, however, were not worn daily by the majority of Romans. The everyday staple was the tunic, a basic wool or linen garment with a belt, long for women, short for men. Laborers and slaves wore simple, plain tunics, whereas senators wore latus clavus, which were marked with wide purple stripes. A senator could be distinguished from a knight by the mere breadth of a stripe. Women wore stolas, which are long, sleeveless gowns that are knotted at the shoulders and belted at the waist. They were frequently worn layered over a tunic. Married ladies increased movement and modesty by covering their heads with a rectangular shawl called a palla. For women of the upper class, looks were power. Every succeeding dynasty saw an increase in the color of fabrics, the complexity of jewelry, and the height of hairstyles. The Romans also cherished shoes. One's position in society was represented in their indoor slippers, boots, and sandals. A senator's red shoes were not the same as a soldier's caligy. Even slaves had to wear a rough tunic, but if their lord desired to flaunt them, they may be clothed nicely. Nothing happened by accident in Rome. Even your attire, which was wrapped in wool, adorned with a brooch, and presented to the public as a walking scroll of status, was a declaration of your citizenship, class, gender, morals, and ambition. The so-called barbarians, a phrase the Romans used to refer to anyone outside their borders, emerged with a new vogue as the Roman Empire fell apart and its togas unraveled. However, these foreigners, Goths, Franks, Celts, Saxons, and Vandals, were not barbaric savages. In addition to being functional, their attire served as a foreshadowing of the future medieval wardrobe. Open tunics and flowing togas were not appropriate for the rough, muddy, and frigid climate of northern Europe. Thus, warmth, mobility, and usefulness were valued in barbaric dress. The predominant material was thick, insulating wool. Cloaks, pants, long-sleeved shirts, and boots with fur linings were commonplace. They were made for riding horses, going on forest hikes, and fighting wars. Among their most significant contributions to the fashion industry, pants. Indeed, the Romans in togas were unfamiliar with the trousers that we now take for granted. Pants were first despised, but when Roman troops adapted them for use in colder climates, they became essential. They eventually were widely used across Europe. Bracas, which were early trousers, were worn by men with a tunic and frequently a leather harness or belt over the chest. Women wore long-sleeved layered wool dresses that were frequently belted at the waist and had flowing cloaks secured with elaborate pins or brooches. Reds, blues, and greens made from plants and minerals were common dyes, and patterns like stripes or checks started to emerge, hinting at Celtic tartans. Additionally, clothing conveyed tribe and loyalty. In addition to being useful, brooches, belt buckles, and fibulae carried symbols of rank, mythology, or ancestry. For instance, the Celts produced elaborate metalwork that combined clothing and art. There were differences in hair and grooming, with some Celtic tribes having facial tattoos, women wearing braids, and warriors sporting long hair and beards. Both sexes frequently wore jewelry made of glass, amber, and bronze. The so-called barbarian attire had established the groundwork for medieval European clothing that was layered, woolen, and realistically constructed by the time the Western Roman Empire collapsed. Rich in significance, beauty, and cultural pride, yet less about ceremonial and more about survival. Ancient garments, such as the woolen cloaks of future kings and the linen kilts of pharaohs, linked together entire civilizations far more than their bodies. Queen Tati was born into a world ablaze, not with flames, but with treachery, ambition, and the gradual slugging of empires over the Levant's delicate spine. Her native country, the Amuru Kingdom, was not as powerful an empire as Egypt or the Hittites. It was tiny, dispersed, and constantly enmeshed in the affairs of larger countries that saw it more as a practical buffer zone than as a sovereign state. Amuru was a region of hills, trading routes, and conflicting allegiances that is now part of western Syria and northern Lebanon. The kingdom had already become a diplomatic hot potato by the time Tati was born, most likely in the 14th century BCE, and was being tossed between Egyptian pharaohs, Mitanni warlords, and the ever-growing Hittite kings. Although it was a crucial location to rule, it was not an easy one. Foreign emissaries, court intrigue, and the ongoing fear of invasion or insurrection would have influenced Tati's early years. She would have had early instruction in the skills of diplomacy, survival, and ceremonial leadership regardless of whether she was born into or married into the royal family. A queen wasn't merely a decorative figure in Amuru culture. She was a mediator, a representation of consistency, and occasionally the unifying force in a split court. The area was changing, the Hittites were gaining strength and territory, and the once dominant Mitanni state was disintegrating. Egypt continued to view Amuru as falling within its area of power under Amenhotep III and then Akhenaten. Local leaders, meanwhile, were always considering their alternatives. Should they try to play both sides, gamble with the Hittites, or swear allegiance to Egypt? During this storm, Tati matured. Her ascent to prominence is noteworthy in and of itself as a woman in a male-dominated political environment. Her inclusion in Hittite diplomatic documents, which are formal letters between monarchs, implies not only prestige, but also power. She wasn't a supporting character. She was seated at the table. Despite the paucity of historical documentation, something important is shown by her name alone. Queen Tati stood out during a period when the majority of women were obliterated from clay and stone. And that was just the start. Alliances seldom ever lasted past a harvest season in the late Bronze Age, and diplomacy was frequently harsh. Nonetheless, Queen Tati is mentioned in the historical record as an identified political actor rather than a footnote, which is nearly unprecedented for a woman in this era. Hittite diplomatic archives mention her particularly in the letters pertaining to Amuru's destiny. It says volumes about her that she is even mentioned. Her appearance in these records has important background. The governing class of Amuru had to choose between siding with the burgeoning Hittite Empire or remaining faithful to the waning Egyptian rule around the time Tati came to power. This was no easy decision. Amuru had long been considered a vassal territory of Egypt. However, the Hittites were rapidly growing and were starting to dislodge Egypt's northern allies one by one. Tati's name comes to light in this risky political game. Tati was involved in the terms that the Hittites were negotiating with the Amuru leadership. According to certain interpretations of the Hittite scriptures, she might have served as a co-ruler or regent, possibly during a period of succession instability, or even as a former king's widow. She had no ceremonial role anyway. She was influential enough that the Hittites, the most powerful state in the Near East at the time, had to recognize her. Tati's political influence also suggests something deeper. Amuru's power structure is adaptable and practical. Smaller kingdoms occasionally permitted or compelled queens to take control when dynastic lines failed, or political survival necessitated wider alliances, in contrast to Egypt or Assyria, where royal women were mainly excluded from rule. What Tati looked like is unknown to us. We have no paintings, busts, or statues. However, we discover something better, proof of her influence, in the dusty lines of clay cuneiform. She held her own in a room full of generals, warlords, ambassadors, and kings. Tati's inclusion in diplomatic documents demonstrates that she was not a pawn in a time when marriages are arranged, treaties are made, and treachery is always one feast away. She played. One must enter a maelstrom of power politics in order to comprehend Queen Tati's society. Between three tectonic plates that were grinding against one another, her country, Amuru, sat like a delicate stone. Egypt ruled from the south, the Hittite Empire arose from Anatolia, and the Mitanni kingdom collapsed to the east. Their rivalries, each posing a unique threat or opportunity, cast a shadow on Tati's reign. Amuru had long been regarded as a component of Egypt's imperial network throughout the late 18th century. Local vassals were installed by pharaohs such as Thutmose III and Amenhotep III, who demanded tribute and expected obedience. However, the Egyptian hold on the northern Levant had started to wane, particularly during Akhenaten's period of religious unrest. Egypt was preoccupied with gods rather than generals, distracted and exposed. The Mitanni, formerly a dominant force in the area, were fast declining in the meantime. They had been vulnerable to invasion from the east and north due to internal conflict and military setbacks. Their old allies were keeping a careful eye on them. Former Mitanni vassal Amuru was becoming more and more alone. The Hittites then arrived, led by Suppiluliuma the Maya, who was a great and merciless leader. Being the ruler of Anatolia was not enough for this king. He had Amuru and the Syrian route in his sights. Suppiluliuma began military operations well into the Levant, defeating Mitanni resistance and capturing successive city-states. He had a straightforward objective: take control of the trade channels, undermine Egypt's might, and encircle key areas like Amuru. Tati had to negotiate this world, which was a triangle of power with ambition blazing at every corner. She couldn't afford to make mistakes. Selecting Egypt put one at danger of Hittite reprisals. Supporting the Hittites could infuriate regional groups that are still pharaoh-aligned, and at best, siding with the rotting Mitanni was a risk. Queen Tati did not, however, disappear in the midst of this storm. She continued to be politically visible, being brought up in Hittite discussions and probably balancing allegiances with each caravan that went through the passes of her territory. She wasn't only getting by, she was moving. Her reign, or regency, took place at one of the late Bronze Age's most unstable periods, and Tati appears to have benefited from the upheaval rather than being crushed by it. To tolerate, not to dominate. During Queen Tati's lifetime, Amuru's foreign policy was rocked by a political earthquake. The kingdom formally joined the Hittite Empire and turned away from Egypt's influence. This was not a hasty decision. It reshaped Amuru's position on the map, led to Egyptian reprisals, and solidified the kingdom's position within one of the Bronze Age's most intricate diplomatic systems. By using both military force and astute diplomacy, the Hittite monarch Suppilulium Athene, a brilliant strategist and expansionist, had already started enticing tiny Levantine kingdoms into his domain. Words alone did not cement the deal when Amuru's leadership, probably led by Queen Tati, decided to change sides. The Hittite cuneiform archives contain a treaty that formalized it. Although it focuses on the male king of Amuru, likely Tati's spouse or a family member, this pact has survived. Tati was not a silent partner, as evidenced by the fact that her name appears in relevant diplomatic letters. She might have been crucial to the talks, particularly in handling the expectations from abroad and the home backlash. The pact outlined important responsibilities. Now Amuru would be a Hittite king's subordinate. The Hittites offered safety in exchange not only from Egypt but also against competing tribes and internal dissension. This went beyond a simple handshake. It was an agreement to survive. This betrayal was not taken lightly in Egypt. The change was considered treason by Pharaoh Akhenaten. A set of clay tablet correspondences between Egyptian authorities and their vassals, known as the Amarna letters, allude to diplomatic indignation and pressing requests. Tati's court must have anticipated reprisals. Strategically, however, it was better to side with the Hittites. Egypt was descending into political and theological instability as a result of Suppilulium's military wars, which had destroyed Mitanni rule. Tati made a calculatedly realistic decision, and certainly we have to say that it was hers as well. An important turning point was the treaty with the Hittites. Amuru gained security, but at a price. The kingdom has ceased to be a buffer of neutrality. It had chosen a side in the conflict between empires, and there was no turning back once you picked a side. This change was not the only thing Queen Tati saw. She guided it. Queen Tati and her court found themselves at the center of a geopolitical maelstrom the instant Amuru formed an alliance with the Hittites. Egypt was incensed. Amuru, which was once seen as a faithful vassal state, had now been openly betrayed by Egypt, and in the Bronze Age, treachery elicited more than simply letters. It sparked reprisals. This tension is reflected in the Amarna letters, a collection of diplomatic exchanges between Egyptian pharaohs and their vassals. Egypt demanded obedience, questioned the honor of Amuru's leadership, and accused them of betraying the country. Although Tati's name isn't prominent in these works, her appearance in Hittite records from the same era indicates that she was actively involved in the storm's backstage operations. The conflict that ensued was a struggle of allegiances as much as an army conflict. Egypt started to pressure its neighbors to cut off Amuru. Skirmishes along the border probably increased. Tati would have had to deal with internal dissension in addition to external challenges. The decision to turn to the Hittites was not supported by everyone in Amuru, particularly by those who had profited from years of Egyptian assistance. The wisdom of this partnership may have been questioned by merchants, military commanders, and perhaps members of the royal household. Tati needed to be cautious. Her closeness to the throne probably enhanced her status, whether as a senior consort, queen mother, or regent. Her background and ability to negotiate would have been essential to keeping the kingdom united. She was doing more than just figuring out military tactics. She was dealing with the psychological effects of war, the emotional terrain of betrayal, and the dissolution of long-standing alliances. Betrayal, however, can also lead to reinvention. Amuru's decision to support the Hittites gave him a new identity as a significant Hittite ally in the Levant, rather than as a small-time Egyptian vassal. There were financial advantages to this repositioning as well. Trade routes changed, Hittite ambassadors and traders came. Under the new arrangements, roads were secured. After being betrayed, Queen Tati had to survive under duress. She left behind a legacy of tightrope diplomacy that has only been partially sustained. The luxury of assurance was not available to her. Any choice could lead to civil turmoil or invasion. But she persevered in the midst of the mayhem. Furthermore, perseverance was frequently the best way to win throughout the Bronze Age. Queen Tati of Amuru left behind something remarkable at an era when the majority of queens were unknown, invisible, and mostly forgotten by official records, a clay carving of a name. There is more to her presence in Hittite diplomatic archives than a passing mention. It's a unique look at a Bronze Age woman's agency and impact on the global scene. Treaties and correspondence between Amuru and the Hittite Empire, especially during the rule of Anatolian master strategist Suppiluliuma Thunsha, reference Tati. Tati was more than just a ceremonial character, as evidenced by these documents, which were preserved on cuneiform tablets discovered in the Hattusa Royal Archive. She either had enough influence to warrant recognition or was actively engaged in diplomatic activities. The political climate in Amuru after its defection from Egypt is detailed in one particular letter. Tati is mentioned with other political figures, implying that she had a say in the kingdom's alliance management, crisis response, and positioning. During the minority of a monarch, was she a queen regent, a widow, standing up for the legacy of her late husband, or maybe the only authority when men aren't around? We cannot be sure. Her name was obviously not ornamental, though. It was working. It was unusual for the Hittites to use their diplomatic language to refer to a queen by name. It indicates that her effect is acknowledged, possibly even respected. Hittite diplomacy was practical and icy. It wasn't flattery that earned titles. The reason Tati was named was because she was a part of the power structure. Given that the majority of foreign correspondence throughout the Bronze Age was between monarchs, this is very noteworthy. If they were mentioned at all, queens were typically silent allies. However, the same records that documented alliances, conflicts, tribute, and treachery also include Tati's name. She speaks through these tablets of clay, through other people's recognition, not in her own words. That in itself makes her unique. Her voice made it onto the record, despite the world being a cacophony of conflict and shifting allegiances during her lifetime. The name of Queen Tati reverberates with subdued power in the administrative hush of old empires. Queen Tati made sure her country would survive by allying Amuru with the Hittite Empire, but at a price. The partnership provided oversight in addition to protection. Suppilulium Awan, the imposing Hittite monarch who changed the Near East with iron will and strategic genius, was at the center of that oversight. Tati had to walk a fine line between collaboration and subordination in order to manage her kingdom's new position under his watchful eye. Suppiluliuma was no docile ruler. In every way but name, he had complete authority over client states like Amuru. He expected obedience, sent envoys, and demanded tribute. It was anticipated that Tati and her court would strictly adhere to the conditions of their pact, providing military assistance, guarding trade routes, and permitting Hittite influence to seep into their governance. Tati probably had to have Hittite advisors at court, and possibly even saw Hittite soldiers stationed close by. She no longer had complete control over her domestic and international choices. She wasn't helpless, though. Tati was skilled at controlling Suppiluliuma's expectations, winning his trust, and using the partnership to strengthen her internal authority rather than disobeying him. It's possible that her true obstacle came from within rather than from the Hittites. It's possible that the new Hittite practices and oversight infuriated local aristocrats, merchants, and religious leaders used to Egyptian support. Tati had to act as a buffer, calming domestic unrest while pleasing her strong lord. That called for the greatest level of diplomacy in addition to a deep comprehension of politics, people, and shifting allegiances. The Hittite king, nevertheless, had enough faith in her court to impose allegiance. That says a lot. Tati's Amuru survived in a time when failing vassals were quickly replaced or destroyed. She was a steady leader. Her name persisted in the diplomatic record. This was not a sovereign queen's freedom. It was something far riskier, the function of an intermediary between the people and the empire, autonomy and survival. And not many were better at that role. Despite living in Suppiluliuma's shadow, Tati was not overshadowed by it. In the harsh calculations of Bronze Age politics, her ability to bend without breaking was a victory in and of itself. It is nearly incredible that Queen Tati survived to be recorded in history. Women's names, much alone their achievements, were not particularly well preserved during the Bronze Age. However, Tati's name lives on, appearing in Hittite diplomatic writings as a statecraft player, rather as a wife or a king's shadow. Even though her legacy is small, it stands out from the hush that surrounded so many other women in her era. There were many regal women in the late Bronze Age, and their impact was subtly enormous. Hittite royal women like Puduhepa, who would become a powerful co-ruler decades later, or Egyptian queens like Tai and Nefertiti. However, the majority of these women were either married to kings in positions of authority or came from strong dynasties. In contrast, Tati originated in or functioned inside a regional buffer state that was perpetually torn between conquest and disintegration. Her appearance in foreign archives is all the more impressive for that reason. We lack Tati statues and monuments, a gold death mask, and a shrine with a stone carving of her face. Her kingdom, which was maintained by treaties, calculated marriages, and compromise, was one of diplomatic survival rather than imposing architecture. Her legacy is inscribed on baked clay tablets rather than marble. They are delicate, easily misplaced, and yet manage to whisper her name over time. She is a unique example of a woman from the Bronze Age who was in a position of authority during a period of profound geopolitical shift. Regardless of her title, Tati had real power, whether she was a queen regent, a reigning consort, or a king's widow. Without losing her hold on power, she managed to negotiate superpower conflicts, treachery from once allies, and the altering political landscape in the Near East. More significantly, her account casts doubt on the idea that women in antiquity were always submissive to male authorities. Tati wasn't forgotten or passive. She was mentioned, documented, and remembered, albeit fleetingly, by scribes who typically only wrote about kings. Her tale serves as a reminder that while history is frequently unjust in its recollection, it is not always blind. Some voices can reverberate across the centuries, even if they are faint and written in clay. Silence shrouds Queen Tati's latter years. More sinister indications replace the clay tablets that formerly held her name, and the documents that record her disappear. The indication that the world is starting to fall apart. The complex web of trade, diplomacy, and royal alliances that had kept the area united for generations was coming to an end as the late Bronze Age did. When and how Tati passed away are unknown to us. We know that Amuru, like many other city-states and kingdoms of the era, was on the verge of being engulfed in the chaos of what contemporary historians refer to as the Bronze Age collapse, a mysterious decades-long period of destruction, depopulation, and cultural fragmentation, even though there is no mention of her burial or inscription bragging about her achievements. The ancient world's great empires collapsed like a set of falling dominoes between 1200 and 1150 BCE. Cities burnt from Anatolia to Canaan, the Hittite Empire fell, and the Greek Mycenaean palaces were deserted. The reason? It is still up for dispute among scholars. Internal uprisings, earthquakes, hunger, drought, war, or the unexpected arrival of the enigmatic sea peoples. It was probably a perfect storm of tragedy, all of them at once. Amurru would not survive because it was sandwiched between the declining Hittites and a resurgent Egypt under Ramses III. Once a boon, its advantageous location has now turned into a liability. Alliances broke up, supply lines dried up, and armies moved through. Tati's once carefully maneuvered political chessboard was turned upside down. The pieces were dispersed as the board flipped. Nevertheless, it is remarkable that we even know her name. Despite her disappearance from the spotlight, Tati lived through and probably governed during one of the most perilous and significant junctures in ancient history. Long after she vanished from the record, her choices, her friendships, and her survival plan continued to have an impact. Ultimately, Queen Tati did not belong to a sweeping dynasty or a great conquest. A political survival in a world in decline, she was something more unique. Her name is still defiant, noble, and distinctive, even though her history is buried beneath ruins and faded into crumbling clay. Not without remembrance, but without a gravestone, a queen. The present-day Mount Rushmore existed in silent grandeur, long before the drills and explosives arrived, unaltered by presidents or chisels. In the early 20th century, it was just another granite peak in South Dakota's untamed Black Hills to the majority of Americans. However, it was considered sacred by the Lakota Sioux, a spiritual hub rather than a stage. They dubbed it Paha Sapa, the center of everything. The Treaty of Fort Laramie, which was signed in 1868, gave the Lakota the Black Hills and guaranteed them the land's perpetual possession. But forever turned out to be short. Prospectors flocked to the area after gold was found there a few years later, and the U.S. government broke the treaty. The Lakota were driven out, and the hills were taken. They dug, sold, and eventually dynamited their hallowed places. The United States was hankering after myth by the 1920s. A new type of identity crisis had arisen, characterized by modernism, fast industrial change, and the pursuit of a common national narrative, despite the tragedy of World War I having passed. In light of this, Doane Robinson, a South Dakota historian, had the audacious notion to engrave enormous representations of American heroes on a mountainside in order to draw tourists and honor the nation's grandeur. Red Cloud, Buffalo Bill, Lewis and Clark, and other Western characters were among Robinson's initial visions. However, the project's focus changed when Gutzon Borglum, a highly ambitious sculptor who loved grandeur and nationalism, arrived. A much more dramatic idea was put out by Borglum, who suggested carving the faces of 4 American presidents into the granite cliffs at a massive scale. The project's chosen mountain was not chosen at random. Solid granite, excellent vision, and advantageous solar exposure were all provided. However, the project's supporters disregarded or ignored the fact that it also stood on territory that had been seized from indigenous people. The mountain didn't even have its now famous Lakota name at the time. In 1885, a visiting lawyer from New York gave the colonial name Mount Rushmore its name. Once teeming with indigenous tales and traditional rhythms, the land was set to undergo a transformation into a monument to ambition, imperialism, and American mythology. The mountain's face was empty, yet not bare. The man who would create the enormous faces of Mount Rushmore was no typical artist. As much of a showman as a sculptor, Gutzon Borglum was preoccupied with monumentality, nationalism, and legacy. He came to South Dakota in the middle of the 1920s with the intention of making history rather than carving a mountain. Borglum, who was born in Idaho in 1867 to Danish immigrants, studied art in Paris and was greatly impacted by the romantic nationalism of 19th-century Europe and classical sculpture. He valued symbolism, magnitude, and the notion that art should evoke a sense of civic pride. He had already established a reputation for taking on ambitious, large-scale projects, and his work was shown in public areas all around the United States. However, a large portion of his early popularity and fame was shaped by his brief and contentious involvement with the Confederate Memorial at Stone Mountain in Georgia. Due to conflicts over creativity and funding, that project failed, though he took with him tremendous experience with granite, explosives, and the pure mechanics of mountain carving. Borglum fled the South in a maelstrom of accusations and broken contracts. Borglum saw a chance to start afresh, bigger, and with complete artistic control when Doane Robinson of South Dakota approached him with his concept to increase tourism through massive sculpture. However, Borglum had no desire to create local heroes. He saw something larger, a monument to American democracy with presidents who, in his opinion, influenced the course of the country. In order to symbolize the establishment, growth, preservation, and progress of the Republic, he selected George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Abraham Lincoln, and Theodore Roosevelt. Through Borglum's intervention, Mount Rushmore was elevated from a state-level tourism stunt to a federal monument project. He was well connected. President Calvin Coolidge even endorsed it. Additionally, he was skilled at pitching patriotic iconography, attracting media attention, and securing funds. Borglum used art as a means of creating myths. However, there was disagreement surrounding his vision as well. He was a staunch patriot, and his history has been marred by his previous associations with white supremacist groups such as the Ku Klux Klan during the Stone Mountain Project. Nevertheless, there was no denying his skill. Additionally, he saw no rock in the Black Hills. He saw the carving of immortality. Hammers and chisels by themselves were never used to create Mount Rushmore. With fury and precision, Gutzon Borglum and a workforce of more than 400 men blasted, drilled, and jackhammered it into life. It was a controlled mayhem. The mountain erupted every day between 1927 and 1941 as granite gave way to vision. George Washington's face served as the starting point, chosen for pragmatic as well as symbolic reasons. Standing more than 60 feet tall, Washington's image would serve as the model for the others. However, sculpting marble is not the same as carving a mountain. Granite is brittle, hard, and prone to breaking. Borglum and his team used a unique combination of engineering and artistry to make it work. Dynamite was the first step in the procedure. The bulk of the mountain was shaved away in sections by blasting crews using precisely calibrated explosives to remove enormous volumes of rock. Following the explosions, point men and drillers would scale scaffolding hundreds of feet above the ground to use hand tools and jackhammers to fine-tune the shapes. Men carved noses and eyebrows out of precipitous cliffs while hanging from ropes. It was perilous, frequently deafening, and strangely intimate work requiring skill. Errors could not be reversed, and each face took years to finish. The tools were startlingly commonplace in spite of their size. Workers employed simple machinery that was driven by creativity and compressors. Although safety was a worry, Borglum proudly cited the fact that astonishingly no one was killed throughout the 14 years of building. A large number of the workers were either jobless laborers from the Great Depression, or miners, or stonecutters. They saw it as a job, a source of income, and a part of their past. Funding was irregular, and progress was sluggish. Just as the project started, the Great Depression struck, causing delays and a continual need for federal assistance. Ever the political operative, Borglum maintained momentum by obtaining New Deal funds and using patriotic language. The mountain became a national myth as the faces of each president appeared, first Washington, then Jefferson, Lincoln, and Roosevelt. It was about ideals more than just similarity. These were symbols made from the same rock as the nation's foundation stories. They were not men. A paradox, however, was concealed beneath each blast and chisel stroke, a monument to freedom chiseled into stolen land by men struggling with economic despair. Millions of tourists view Mount Rushmore as a stone temple to democracy and a patriotic emblem. However, it is a wound to the Lakota Sioux. Long before the first dynamite blast ever reverberated through the cliffs, the Lakota people revered the Black Hills, or Paha Sapa, where the monument was sculpted. This was more than simply granite to them, it was sacred. The Black Hills were permanently promised to the Lakota people by the 1868 Treaty of Fort Laramie. However, the U.S. government shattered that deal when gold was found in the area a few years later. The soldiers arrived, then came the settlers. The center of Lakota spiritual and cultural life was taken along with the land. The Lakota had lost more than just land by the time Guts and Borglum showed up with scaffolding and designs. Every treaty ever signed had become untrustworthy to them. The faces of 4 American presidents, George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, 2 figures linked to the uprooting of Native American communities and the spread of settler colonialism, were then selected to be carved into the hills as if to twist the knife. According to the Lakota, Mount Rushmore is not a monument, it is a defilement. It stands for land theft, unfulfilled promises, and the continuous elimination of indigenous sovereignty. Additionally, it contrasts with Thunderhead Mountain, a nearby peak, where Lakota elders eventually commissioned the Crazy Horse Memorial, another enormous carving, as a counter-memorial. It is currently unfinished but is expanding yearly. When Mount Rushmore was proposed, the Lakota were not consulted. Their objections were disregarded. Both public opinion and federal courts overruled their cultural claims to the land. Through activism, legal challenges, and symbolic actions like as the 1980 Supreme Court decision in United States versus Sioux Nation, which recognized that the Black Hills were acquired illegally, they still fight for their rights today. Compensation was given to the Lakota, but they have rejected the funds. They desire the return of the land. Mount Rushmore is therefore laden with unresolved strife despite its seeming silence and immobility. There is more to it than a memorial. It's a mirror. Additionally, what you see reflected may appear as pride or agony, depending on your perspective. The first thing to show through the stone was George Washington's visage, a 60-foot portrait of the guy who is frequently referred to as the country's father. Washington was selected by Guts and Borglum to represent the founding of the United States, its revolution, its principles, and its initial identity as a new republic. The visage that emerged, however, was more than a likeness when the granite was blasted away. It was stone carved from legend. Beginning in 1930, Washington's carving served as the model for the remainder of the monument. His face was gradually revealed after years of work with everything from explosives to precise chiseling. According to Borglum, the term conveys a sense of ageless leadership and serene power. The symmetry needed to be perfect. Just the snout was more than 20 feet long. Thomas Jefferson, who was initially supposed to be carved to Washington's right, came next. However, the half-cut face had to be blown away because the granite was too unstable. Construction was redone from scratch, with Jefferson moved to Washington's left. Time, money, and morale were all lost in the setback. Eventually, however, Jefferson's face emerged, gazing over the Black Hills with a determined distance. Jefferson was selected to symbolize American growth, especially through the Louisiana Purchase. His inclusion, however, has significance that goes beyond politics. Jefferson was a multifaceted individual. He was a visionary Democrat and a writer of liberty, But he also owned slaves and saw indigenous territories as part of the expanding American state. In addition to being symbolic, carving these two founders into Lakota Holy Territory was divisive. Washington had directed military operations against indigenous groups. The foundation for decades of displacement was laid by Jefferson's policies that promoted westward settlement. Nonetheless, these men represented freedom, reason, and the enlightened principles that formed the Republic to a large number of Americans. They represented a pantheon of American gods to Borglum. He desired for their faces to endure for ages, to look with timeless authority at the destiny of the country. Mount Rushmore, a monument that depicts not just four persons but also the narrative that America tells about itself, had started to take shape when Washington and Jefferson were finished. Depending on which side of history you are looking at, you may see conquerors or founders. Mount Rushmore was already establishing itself as a national landmark, with Washington and Jefferson finished. Gutzon Borglum, however, was not done yet. He turned to Abraham Lincoln and Theodore Roosevelt to finish his vision of America's development. These two presidents were picked not because they were close to the founding, but rather because of their ability to guide the nation through times of crisis and change. Borglum's personal favorite was the third carved visage, that of Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln, the man who ended slavery and kept the Union intact during the Civil War, was regarded by him as a unifier. Lincoln represented the nation's preservation to Borglum. During the nation's darkest moment, his grim, sunken-eyed countenance conveyed the weight of leadership. Lincoln's visage was meticulously carved into the granite over the course of years, 1937-1939. His distinctive beard, high cheekbones, and deeply set eyes were all gradually carved, frequently by hand using pneumatic hammers. Theodore Roosevelt followed, who at the time was a more unusual pick. He was chosen by Borglum to symbolize the growth of contemporary America, its industrial power, its aspirations for economic success, and its expanding influence around the world. Borglum had known Roosevelt personally, and he saw him as the perfect example of dynamic leadership because of his progressive reforms, trust-busting activities, and environmental conservation initiatives. Roosevelt's visage, with its thick-rimmed spectacles and recessed position between Lincoln and Jefferson, presented a technical problem. Metal rods were used to suggest the lenses as the detail was meticulously carved into the stone. There was controversy about his inclusion. Roosevelt had not yet merited a place among the other titans of American history, according to his detractors, but Borglum persisted and won. The four parts of the story, birth, expansion, preservation, and development, were finished by Lincoln and Roosevelt working together. It was a march through American ambition in chronological order, as perceived by its most influential leaders. However, each of these leaders, especially Lincoln and Roosevelt, left behind complex legacies that included internal conflict, imperialism, and indigenous policy. Nevertheless, their faces, now larger than life, were meant to last. They were sculpted to last for millennia. And Mount Rushmore became more than simply a piece of art as their stone faces developed. It began to represent what the nation desired these men to be rather than who they actually were. The construction of Mount Rushmore was a political scurry as much as an artistic achievement. The project was caught up in the waves of American nationalism, economic hardship, and bureaucratic red tape from the beginning. It took more than vision to carve four enormous faces onto a mountain. A lot of money was needed. Additionally, Gutzon Borglum pursued every dollar with tenacity. The economy was still booming in 1927 when work started. However, the Great Depression struck only 2 years later, and financing dwindled nationwide. Banks faltered, breadlines developed, and infrastructure projects fell apart. Mount Rushmore, however, persisted. Why? Because Borglum was aware of the politics of pride and the power of spectacle. He presented the monument as more than just a presidential homage. He marketed it as a monument to democracy and a ray of optimism during a dark period. He spoke to everybody who would listen, courted presidents, and lobbied Congress. Borglum was more than just a painter. Mount Rushmore served as the stage for his propaganda. Under Franklin D. Roosevelt and the New Deal, the federal government started investing heavily in public works projects in the 1930s. Through the National Park Service, Borglum was able to obtain government funding, turning the monument from a local curiosity into a national undertaking. Suddenly, the notion of engraving American glory on a mountain became a lifeline for the economy, generating jobs, increasing tourism, and igniting patriotism. However, the procedure of raising money wasn't easy. Borglum insisted on having complete artistic control, fought against creative compromises, and frequently clashed with oversight boards. He attempted to extend the idea beyond the four faces by suggesting entire torsos, an entablature, and a magnificent hall of records beyond the heads, but he frequently overstated progress in order to obtain additional funding. These were never finished. Support from the public was not uniform. Many were proud of the project because they believed it demonstrated that America could persevere and grow even during difficult times. However, detractors viewed it as wasteful, particularly during times of famine. Others questioned why these specific presidents, all white, all male, and representative of expansionist policies, were chosen for political reasons. But the money continued to flow in. Despite being costly and having flaws, the dream persisted. Every dollar raised, in Borglum's opinion, was a vote of faith in both his monument and the American legend it was intended to preserve. By the late 1930s, Mount Rushmore was beginning to take shape, with scaffolding still rising, 3 presidents finished, and a 4th in the works. However, Gutzon Borglum, the man who created the monument, passed away unexpectedly in March 1941 due to complications after surgery. He was 73. The project had lost its motivation when the man who had envisioned, battled, and hammered this idea into stone passed away. The project saw a surge of uncertainty following Borglum's passing. He had been more than just the sculptor. He had been the visionary who brought everything together, the architect, the fundraiser, and the public face. No one possessed the same blend of political acumen and artistic clarity without him. Yes, there were blueprints. Models made of plaster were present. However, the vitality had vanished. After years of working under his father's tutelage, Lincoln Borglum, his modest and devoted son, took over the project. Though far less ostentatious, he was capable and dedicated. Lincoln adopted a more realistic stance than Gutzon, who envisioned complete torsos, inscriptions, and intricate finishing touches. He concentrated on finishing Roosevelt's face and securing the location because time was running out and money was limited. Next came World War II, which caused America's goals to change as it focused on other countries. The war effort received a reallocation of federal funds. From monuments, national passion shifted to mobilization. Statues were suddenly not the most important thing to construct. The official end of the work was October 31st, 1941. Even though Borglum's initial design left the carvings unfinished, they were nevertheless imposing. Unfinished and underused, the Hall of Records, which was supposed to store American documents and ideals, remained a secret chamber behind Lincoln's head. It would be the location of a locked archive of historical records only decades later. Nevertheless, Mount Rushmore was a completed concept even though it was unfinished. Though not quite what Borglum had imagined, the 4 presidential faces that stared out over the Black Hills were strong enough to become iconic. The mountain was altered by Borglum's passing. The dream was frozen in place. Like the stone it was carved from, the monument, which had once been brimming with aspiration, became firm, motionless, and silent. As a towering representation of national pride, tourist attraction, and political intricacy, Mount Rushmore stands as one of the most identifiable sites in the United States today. It is a magnificent celebration of American values, according to some. It serves as a sobering reminder of the price of dominion to others. Depending on who you ask, its meaning can change. The 60-foot faces of Washington, Jefferson, Lincoln, and Roosevelt are visible to almost 2 million visitors annually. Photographs, patriotism, and the sheer wonder of the engineering are the reasons they come. However, Mount Rushmore's legacy is complex beneath the surface. Discussions concerning history, racism, land rights, and national identity have been sparked by the monument. Critics contend that it exalts leaders who managed the US's growth at the direct expense of Native American countries. For many, carving their faces onto Lakota Holy Land, land taken against federal treaties, is a permanent injustice. The Lakota do not view Mount Rushmore as a symbol of freedom. It's a scar. Those who view the monument as an homage to leadership, a result of American tenacity and grit during the Great Depression, and a testament to American endurance, have nevertheless vigorously supported it. It has been used as a shorthand for America itself in movies, ads, textbooks, and political rallies. Presidents have also voiced their opinions. It was dubbed a monument to American exceptionalism by Ronald Reagan. While acknowledging the site's beauty, Barack Obama pointed out its inconsistencies. There, activists have demonstrated. There, visitors have proposed marriage. It is a holy and contentious site of pilgrimage. In the meantime, copies of the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, and a brief biography of Borglum are now kept in the incomplete Hall of Records, which is located behind Lincoln's head. They are kept hidden inside a mountain in a titanium vault for the discovery of future civilizations. Mount Rushmore is ultimately more than just a sculpture. It is a tale etched in granite, revised by time and discussed by all the generations. Like the nation it was intended to symbolize, it is a tall, unfinished national myth.